we cannot continue to view the ocean simply as a resource to be exploited because of man's manifest destiny or some other modern philosophy like that, which really doesn't have a place in the future. We need to reconstruct as societies who are facing climate change. If we don't work together now to solve this global issue, we don't really stand a chance of survival.
Welcome to the We Need to Act, the podcast about the people, ideas, and movements shaping a better now. I'm Sarah, your host, an academic and sustainability professional who believes that understanding the world is the first step to changing it. Each episode, I sit down with extraordinary guests from around the world, scientists, activists, Indigenous leaders, entrepreneurs, and thinkers who are doing the work and leaving the change. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. And if you are coming back, welcome home. My guest today is Dr. Mary Takoko, a Māori conservationist from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and one of the leading voices behind the movement to grant whales legal personhood across the Pacific. She's the chief executive of the Pacific Whale Fund and is working to recover 1 million whales across Pacific waters. Thank you, Dr. Mary, for joining us on the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to have you with us. And for those listening who don't know you, you are a prominent Māori conservationist, ocean leader, and advocate for whale legal personhood from New Zealand.
Kia ora koutou. Ko hikurangi te maunga, ko waiapu te awa, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, ko Māui te tipuna, ko Paikea anō, tētahi o ōku tipuna, no Aotearoa hau. I'm just sharing my GPS coordinates, essentially. My sacred mountain is Hukurangi, the mountain from which our ancestor Māui fished up the lands of Aotearoa New Zealand. I'm sharing my sacred river, the river Waiapu, that sustained my people for many generations. And, of course, my tribe, Ngāti Porou, one of the largest, actually the largest ocean tribe in New Zealand that carry a very strong connection and legacy of voyaging all the way back to Raiatea in the Pacific. And lastly, I also shared and acknowledged my other ancestor, Paikea, of which I hope we will talk more about. Paikea is, of course, famous in my tribe because he arrived to New Zealand on the back of a whale and is one of the many ancestors, actually, that enjoyed an incredible kinship-based relationship with these sentient beings, the tōhora.
It's so beautiful to hear you talking about, I didn't understand a thing, but it touched me. To let you know that it touched me because we perceive the world with our own languages, and Indigenous language have such a richness that our language doesn't. And it's beautiful. Thank you. And you have set an ambitious goal that is restoring 1 million whales and cetaceans to the Pacific as a climate solution. What does that look like in practice? That's really ambitious goal.
Well, it's a great question. And I guess to understand what this looks like, for me, we first have to understand why whales are the ultimate climate champions and vital ocean ecosystem engineers. Science is clear. Industrial whaling wiped out an estimated 81% of great whale biomass. 2 million alone were taken from the southern hemisphere and the oceans that I call home. And to put that scale of loss into perspective, a single great whale essentially can store around 33 tons of CO2 over its lifetime. Now that's equivalent to the work of 1,200 to 1,500 trees. So by decimating our whale populations, we didn't just lose animals, which some people think of the whale as. We actually ripped tens of millions of tons of vital carbon capture capacity straight out of our Moana, our oceans. But beyond storing carbon, in their bodies and taking it to the deep when they pass away, when they die, which are called the whale fall. This process is called the whale fall. They also help to drive the whale pump. So their nutrient-rich plumes, of course, fertilize the ocean's surface. They stimulate phytoplankton blooms that absorb massive amounts of atmospheric carbon. And of course, that phytoplankton is, the krill feeds on those phytoplanktons, and then the whale eats the krill And that cycle continues, mounting to what my very good friend and mentor, Dr. Ralph Shami, describes as a virtuous cycle. And it's important that I acknowledge him and his work, where a lot of this thinking was actually taken to the world through his research. And coming back to the question, how we achieve this in practice is through active marine rewilding across all levels of the trophic system. We aren't just passively waiting for whale populations to bounce back, because as we know, whale recovery in the Pacific and other oceans has been uneven. Even though we've got moratoriums on whaling, there are new pressures such as climate change that are impacting on the food web and therefore directly impacting our whale populations, amongst a whole raft of modern issues such as ship strikes and of course ghost nets. There's so many things and challenges that they face. So through our model, the Moananui Sanctuary model, our focus is to establish a vast, interconnected, trans-Pacific network that could encompass up to 30 million square kilometres. That's really looking at the Polynesian area and, of course, working with our relatives in other parts of the Pacific. And it involves essentially using our traditional, dynamic, Indigenous-led marine practices such as rāhui and Āvei Moana to create safe corridors free from human threats. So, part of that solution does come to creating these sanctuaries and safe havens for our whales, but it also takes a more holistic approach where we have to look at the right legal and financial levers that can accelerate, and build on those essential protections. So we'll talk about whale legal personhood later, but without the combination of thinking about a solution that has self-sustaining in terms of financially self-sustaining for Pacific nations, is Indigenous-led, because, we are a largely Indigenous region, and we have thousands of years of living in our space and understanding how our ocean ecosystems work, coupled with, modern science and technology. We really won't be able to recover the 1 million whales. I guess that's how I'll answer that first question without going too deeply into the specifics of our model. But ultimately, we're looking at a three-tiered approach, starting from essential protections of our ocean, also the legal protection of the whale herself, and of course looking at all of those challenges she faces as she's migrating out of safe waters into the high seas, which are not surveilled very well in the Pacific. So we're also looking at technological solutions where we can monitor her as she moves through those waters.
And it's really important. Thank you for sharing all those facts with us. And I wanted to go back to something you said, which is related to the next question. And you said that the majority of people see whales as just animals, not as ancestors or relatives. And there's so much we don't know about the animal world, or I don't like it to put it that way, but to the other beings. And recently, scientists filmed a whale giving birth while others worked around to help her. And that was really an impactful image. And so there's so much we don't yet understand about these beings that have existed long before us. What can we learn from them and from your Indigenous perspective?
Brilliant. When I see that footage, what I think about is, what we're witnessing goes beyond what could be perceived as merely a biological instinct. It's actually empirical evidence that shows the profound sentience and complex culture of whales. So, of course, I come from a worldview where the whales are ancestors. I can show you my genealogy that takes me back to the whales. But for us, the whales have always been considered ariki, chiefs, coming from a chiefly line, and the tuakana of our oceans. So they play a very, very important role, not only scientifically, but spiritually and culturally. So they are highly evolved, self-aware beings, and they possess their own language. And in fact, scientists can share the different regional dialects that whales sing and speak to each other and to the ocean herself. So, what it's about for me is really trying to engage in intergenerational knowledge transfer of these beautiful values and understandings, which many cultures have lost, unfortunately, through the transition of industrialism, which has brought in a whole bunch of other values where nature has become separate from our perspective of who we are. Indigenous peoples have always well understood that we are all related. That's not just a catch cry or a wise proverb. That's a biological fact. So, the practice that that footage shows is what I would call cooperative guardianship. It's about shared midwifing of a baby's birth, and it's about protecting the vulnerable. It really proves that the whales operate on a highly sophisticated ethical framework. And I guess the primary lesson they offer humanity, and one that, I come from a culture that understood this very well and actually modeled some of our social values and ethical frameworks around observations of the whales, is one of, again, mutual cooperation and interdependence. So the whales demonstrate that resilience in a vast, unpredictable ocean relies entirely on whanaungatanga or kinship. And of course, aroha, compassion and mutual care. These are central values for Māori, not just in Aotearoa, but our people encompass the entire Polynesian. We are all related to one another through the ancestor I shared earlier, Maui, Tiki Tiki Ātaranga. So I guess further surmising on that, what I would say is that those actions really teach us about what true survival means, and that we need to exercise mutual care in this modern day reality. And the whales in that, for me, are a bridge to kind of be thinking away from this individualistic way of operating back to a tribal way of operating where we all look after each other. And so, observing the tohora, the whale, we can learn many things, but particularly we cannot continue to view the ocean simply as a resource, which we spoke about, to be exploited because of man's manifest destiny or some other modern philosophy like that, which really doesn't have a place in the future. We need to reconstruct as societies who are facing climate change. If we don't work together now to solve this global issue, we don't really stand a chance of survival. That's what I think of when I look at that footage, and I think about the, I guess, kinship responsibilities of the whale and the role that they play in the entire web of love.
That's so true. And I wanted to highlight what you just said about mutual care. And we need so much in human beings. We need to learn more from whales regarding mutual care, because we have been apart from nature and also being isolated from our communities. And we are social beings that really need that. And as a descendant of Maui and Paikea, is it how we say? From
Beautiful. Yes, Paikea.
Paikea from Ngāti Rua Waipu. How do you say that?
Ngāti Rua Waipu.
Ngāti Rua Waipu. Okay. Your connection to whales is deeply rooted in your culture, as we spoke before. Could you share something more personal, what that relationship means to you?
Absolutely. I did touch on it slightly before, but for us, kinship and connection, it's not a modern conservation concept. It's very in vogue right now with some of the big bingos running around trying to get involved in the movement that we've essentially created here in Aotearoa and other islands in the Pacific. It's an ancient lived reality of my people that we can evidence through many, many generations. So my lineage, for instance, is anchored in my sacred mountain, Hukurangi, the Waiapu River, and my family, the Takoko family. We trace our genealogy, our whakapapa, back to Maui Tiki Tiki Ātaranga, who fished up Tika Maui, the North Island of New Zealand, using his waka nukutai memeha. So my family is actually both Ngāti Rua Waipu and Ngāti Ua Pohatu. And I'm sharing that because for us, in our tradition and the large amount of oral traditions that have been passed down from our clans, we consider ourselves the first peoples of Aotearoa. We arrived before many other tribes that currently occupy New Zealand. No other tribe can evidence our connection to Maui and the first discoverers of our islands like Ngāti Pro. And I'll say that because I've done extensive research on this matter. So Maui's discovery of Aotearoa also, for us, it represents the cosmological kind of origins of life coming from the ocean and onto the land. So essentially, when he fished up our islands, he was converting the ocean, the Moana, into land. And he did that so that his descendants could thrive. So this is part of the great legacy of my people. What you're interested in is my tipuna Paikea. So my relationship to Paikea, who was our ancestor who arrived to New Zealand on the back of a whale. He arrived actually met one of my ancestors, Huturangi, on my family land, extended family lands, and we continue to guard that and protect that sacred space. He had come after being saved by a whale in the oceans. Imagine that incredible bond he would have shared. People think of this as a fantastical story, but for us, it's not myth. It's, our truth. So in that act, what actually was occurring is the establishment of a covenant. It's an ancient treaty in my worldview. It's a recognition of the mutual sentience sentience shared between human and nature, and because our ancestors had the chance and the ability to communicate to whales so that they would assist us during times of need. We have many, many stories of voyaging canoes being saved by whales, which are famous in my tribe. And because of this, we can't view whales as purely natural capital resources, or even because of their role to sequester carbon. That's not front of mind for us. Those are all things that are very, very important to scientists, to lawmakers, to economists, to people who follow this Western paradigm of thinking, which we're actually trying to not move beyond, but embellish, to be able to say that these are actually our kin. They possess their own modi or life essence and sovereign culture. And that's where I want to move the debate about legal personhood eventually, is to be seeing whales and other beings within our oceans that play a similar role as their own as sovereign beings. So this legacy of guardianship, or what we call kaitiakitanga, was actually passed down from Paikea through my ancestors to chiefs of the northern clans that I descend from, like Takoko and Harawira Huriwai, both whom were chiefs of Ngāti Rua Waipu, but also linked with Oe Pōhatu, the people of Māui. They fiercely protected our customary rights to our oceans and actually defended thousands of acres of land, in combination with other chiefs from the northern clans. And so when we think about the ocean, it's just there's this beautiful mandate that our people come with, right back to Maui and actually even beyond that to the gods. And once you start thinking that frame of mind, your actions and the way you relate to nature completely change. It's not about what can I extract that's going to help me and my agency as a human. It's not about that. It's about beautiful principles that we all need to get better at practicing, like respect, responsibility, and reciprocity with all life across this planet. So what I'm doing today, working on things like whale legal personhood and the Moananui Sanctuary, is actually about enforcing this 22 generation old treaty, half a millennia. I can track back to that ancestor here, and of course his grandparents in our tradition are indeed whale gods. So that's why we believe we have that genetic heritage coming down directly from the whales. So I hope that made sense, but ultimately, this relationship means that I don't just wake up, I don't just work in ocean policy, rather. I actually hold an inherited sovereign duty to protect our ancestors and to rebuild the relationship between tangata or people and taio or nature. We have to fiercely hold the line for our ancestors, and of course the ancestral sea roads or aramona that both my people and the whales shared together. Because without the whales, we would never have actually discovered Aotearoa. Our ancestors voyaged with nature, voyaged with the whales as they left Raiatea and make, their way annually down to our waters.
Thank you so much for sharing that personal story. And there are so many stories also of this connection between whales and human beings and also dolphins. So it is really beautiful, and we should, as you said, also have this respect because we are part of nature. We are nature itself, as I'm just paraphrasing Casey Kemp-Horinek from the Ponca Nation, saying that we are nature itself. And also we have to think 7 generations ahead when taking any action. So can you tell us more about this legal personhood and why does it matter and how could it change our relationship with whales and other beings?
Sure. I had the immense privilege to author He Whakaputanga Moana Declaration, which essentially under customary law confers legal personhood on the whale. Our goal was at that point to be able to translate our ancient kinship with the ocean into what is essentially a binding trans-Pacific cultural but also legal framework that many ariki or paramount chiefs have signed throughout the Pacific. My focus at that point was to acknowledge and reawaken that role of the ariki or royal families, often who haven't had the ability to guard their waters because of colonial powers in our region. So I was lucky enough to receive the support of the tribes involved with Hine Moana Halo, so I acknowledged them. But the greatest support that I did receive was indeed from the office of the late Māori King, Tu Heitia. And in terms of the drafting, key individuals that provided support to me directly were Michelle Bender from Ocean Vision Legal, Dr. Ralph Shami, of course, who helped us to go beyond just thinking about the rights of nature framework to actually also looking at the mechanics that can support a legal personhood. I call it the macroeconomics of legal personhood, things like sustainable finance. There's a raft of solutions that are actually embedded in the framework. And of course, I must acknowledge my other colleagues, Dinah Nyberg and Linda Burkison. So going back to the late Māori King, whose participation in this effort took it global. Without him, I don't think we would have achieved the attention that has been, the 2 billion people tuned into the story, and it's had a long-lasting impact. Many groups, huge institutions are now rushing into the Pacific to be part of this movement, which is a beautiful thing. So just going back to the signing, it was an alliance of different paramount chiefs from Aotearoa, the Cook Islands and Tahiti. And the idea eventually was taken, or the declaration was taken by the king to places like Hawaii and Alaska. So there's essentially been chiefs from all various islands of Polynesia who have endorsed or ratified the declarations. That's incredibly important, even though it's would be considered by Western law a non-legally binding framework. For us, it provides the very, very important cultural mandate. Now, I've carried that through to developing legislation that can be essentially utilised by any Pacific state so that they're not starting from scratch. The idea is to save them both time and resources. I had probably in total, there would have been 60 pairs of eyes over this legislation, making sure that it was holistic, and like I mentioned, going beyond rights of nature frameworks that we currently see. So it is, in that sense, a very progressive piece of legislation. But coming back to your essential question, by conferring legal personhood, what we do is actually grant whales legally enforceable protections that states have to uphold, and so does industry. So that includes things like the right to a healthy environment, healthy habitats. It includes the freedom of movement without worrying about ship strikes and these other anthropogenic pressures that are causing whale deaths as they migrate from their nursery grounds back to waters off the Antarctica, for instance, to feed. But crucially, it also helps to serve as a structural defence, I would say, against what I call blue grabbing or blue colonialism, which is a huge issue in the Pacific that no one talks about. And right now, what we're actually seeing is a rise in what I call philanthrocapitalism. You essentially have these big conservation bingos who are replicating what I believe to be an extractive conservation practice. That is one of the reasons why I departed from Conservation International and my tribe. Didn't join Hina Mona Halo because we could see that this could undermine our self-determination. And so, we're working on another approach of how we can ensure that these big institutions that are controlling foreign aid monies are getting millions of dollars that Indigenous communities never see. The big universities coming in from America mostly, and running. It's a David versus Goliath battle. We, the Davids, who have been putting all the work and effort, often it's been a labour of love with no any kind of compensation. Of course, when it comes to it, and when these groups see that there's something in it for them, that they are essentially coming into the Pacific right now, and what I view them to be doing is distorting he Whakaputanga Moana to suit their own and align with their own narratives. So I do have an issue with that. However, my organisation is doing what we can to ensure that the mana or the integrity of he Whakaputanga Moana isn't lost to political expediency or these foreign pressures that we see in the Pacific. So He Whakaputanga Moana is kind of like the baseline that provides that ethical, cultural mandate for us to proceed in the legal personhood movement. That to inform Te Mana o Te Tohora, which is a legal framework that I led as part of my PhD, but with the support of Ocean Vision Legal, Simmons and Simmons London, many great minds and groups all over the world. And right now we have released that model bill to Tonga and to Tahiti. So it's just going through the motions where we're connecting with communities before they're actually introduced into by both of those parliaments, or as French Polynesia, the Assembly. So ultimately what we're trying to do is kind of shift our legal baseline from extraction to active guardianship, noting that Indigenous people can't be left behind this time. We need to move beyond the rhetoric, because what we know is only 1% of conservation finance is coming into the hands of the people who actually do the work. The Indigenous peoples and local communities, trying to deconstruct that conservation model and create, looking at our traditions like rahui, our dynamic marine protections, breathing life back into those, so that they are also legally enforceable, because in our view, they are mechanisms that have been used by our people for thousands of years. They're way more practical than locking out oceans with MPAs. The idea is that you create a protection or rahui around pods of whales as they travel. And essentially, the rahui moves with them across countries, and what that would do is, if there's no legal protections in place in one state, the idea here is that this rahui would be at least acknowledged by these states during the times that they're migrating. If we can do that alone, we're going to, this will be a great service to our whales, and of course uphold that ancient covenant that we have with our kin.
I'm certain it will succeed, and it's so sad to hear about these big institutions. Actually, colonialization never ended; it just evolved.
Well,
in many ways.
Unfortunately, some groups are purely motivated by money and control. This paradigm that is being introduced, for some reason, has been quite threatening to some. So I'm hoping that once Moananui Sanctuary is established, we can, basically balance the playing field for our Indigenous communities. Because what will happen is, if those big conservation organisations continue to lead this, the conservation effort in the Pacific, which we see now, what that will do is ultimately undermine our customary rights. So that's something that I very much am aware of, and I'm someone that has been working a lot in the protection of the customary marine rights of my people. So it's an incredible topical issue for us today.
Thank you. And it is our purpose on this podcast to be like a platform for diversity, inviting different people from all over the world to share their worldviews, their experiences without this Western nice vision.
Yeah, what we've seen in the Pacific is that these organisations have actually been quite ineffective if you look at the millions that they've been resourced with. So my thing is, okay, we need to rebalance those finance flows. We need to cut out the middle men and women, quite frankly. Those finance flows need to go directly from the source to Indigenous communities without the middle people. So that's what we're trying to achieve with the Moananui Sanctuary, is to make sure that we can support Indigenous communities with the technical, technical aspects that they will require for a plan like legal personhood, but to make sure that we're not sacrificing our customary rights in the process.
That's great. I'm just recalling a project from in the Amazon forest.
Exactly.
That they are paying Indigenous people directly to protect nature. So they are giving like a per diem or a fee for them just to do what they normally do, but to have the means they need to do that. And what role do Indigenous people and local communities play in restoring the ocean? And it's really important, and you have already mentioned that. And how can that be supported in a truly empowering way?
Well, to support us in a truly empowering way, we can't just be considered stakeholders that are consulted as part of what I consider to be a top-down Western conservation model. We must be the sovereign architects of our solutions. Part of this mandate and thinking is what's propping up our latest initiative for Moananui Sanctuary, which is the Āvei Moana voyage. We're about to embark on a monumental 2-year expedition that's being launched in my tribal community at the end of this month, and we'll be traversing the Pacific Ocean. We're not waiting for international aid or foreign NGOs to save our waters. Through Āvei Moana, we're trying to re-democratise conservation and give local communities the power, and we'll equip them with the tools to be able to do that. So we'll be actively sailing across our Aramoana, our ancestral sea roads, which are part of our customary marine areas, all the way back from here, Maigat tribal community. We have a customary sea road that goes all the way back to Raiatea. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that that space is protected. And through the Āvei Moana voyage, we'll also be actively looking to weave together and establish the Moananui Sanctuary network, ensuring that we have all Indigenous communities along the way that we're visiting can be part of this vision. The idea with the voyage is that we will be merging Indigenous knowledge systems or mātauranga with cutting-edge ocean science. Our vessel, the Resilience, which is captained by, we have a beautiful captain and actually partner that we're working with on this, called Apparent Winds. Their vessel, our vessel, is 75 foot and it's fully equipped with everything that we need to be able to do our research on whales. So, the idea is that we'll be able to track whale populations. We'll be able to produce scientific evidence to be able to mitigate things like ship strikes. We'll be able to gather high integrity data for our monitoring platform called WhaleArk. And of course, we have partnerships with 5 tech groups that are helping us to build this platform. So, we've done this through what I call an economy of aroha. We haven't had to rely on millions and millions of dollars. I can do more with nothing, quite frankly, than a big NGO can do with $1 million. That's my perspective. That's because we come with the authority and power of our customary rights. So instead of backing frameworks like just natural capital, we're looking at ways where we can still engage with nature markets, but, that's aligned more closely with our values, because ultimately we're going to have to fund groups to be able to do the conservation work that's required. That includes restoring whale habitats, as well as, the monitoring.
I was just curious about where do you get the funding? Because it's a different model, right? So it's partnering.
Yeah, so it's all about partnering with like-minded organisations. we're probably in kind services that we've received are in the $1 million vicinity. That includes, to build out whale ark, which will be one of the more expensive aspects of the project, as well as funding the voyage. The voyage costs $250,000 per annum. So it's huge. It's huge, and so we're really lucky that actually what people are interested in is being part of a beautiful Indigenous-led vision that's going somewhere. You know, we don't sit around board tables and talk about this. We're actually out there doing the work on the oceans with our relations. It's not something that we're coming from this abstract conservation space. We're hiding behind computers or sipping lattes in cafes talking about it miles and miles away. This is about active uh, conservation practice where Indigenous communities, side by side, Western scientific communities are working together to be able to affect the solution, which began with He Whakaputanga Moana, which was based on my PhD research and the traditions of my people of Ngāti Pro, to make it a reality across multiple domains, including the global economy, law, finance. If we can do that, essentially what we're creating is a movement that all elements of society can back, and that's important. This isn't just about what the sentience of the whale and the cultural and spiritual aspects. It's actually backed by a solution that recognizes we have to take everyone in society with us. But most importantly, it's the Indigenous voice and leadership in ocean governance that needs to remain central. And so it's my job to kind of be the witness there. And I will be calling out some of these big AI groups, for instance, that are moving into the space that I'm operating in, because actually at an ethical level, there are some issues that we as Indigenous people have with AI groups like SETI. One of those things is that I've heard communities in Tahiti, for instance, talk about is, well, if they are able to create language and communicate with the whale, what if that technology falls in the hands of the wrong individuals? We've seen that time and time again. Technology that's created for good is taken over by forces that don't utilize it for good. So, one of those comments that I've taken away from me from discussions in Tahiti is the real fear that AI will be eventually used to control whale populations, because that's the command and control theory of Western conservation. So it's something I'm watching quietly, and be afraid to be vocal about.
Thank you for sharing that. And I didn't know about that. And yes, I'm also afraid about AI in general. And it can be, of course, a tool to help us in many ways tackle some of the problems. But as you said, in the wrong hands,
That's right. And
might be
for us,
harm.
this movement is actually about the recovery of our AI. Our AI is ancestral intelligence. We don't need a mediator between, to help us engage with our ancestors. We already have the toolbox to do that. We have our sacred traditions. We have our karakia, our prayers, and Tahiti is a great example where you still have knowledge keepers who can literally call out to the whales and the whales will come in. In my community, we have that tradition also. We consider ourselves the clans of Tangaroa. That's something, because I come from Tahiti, my ancestors come from Tahiti. We all shared in this beautiful covenant with our tohora, and we need to revive that. Before we even contemplate artificial intelligence, it's about reclaiming our ancestral intelligence.
That's so true. That's so true. And in language oral traditions, and I'm reading a book by Paul Ocken, Carbon. I don't know if you know him, and he also mentions about that the oral traditions and the amount of information that Indigenous people carry on that, knowing exactly the weather, if they is going to be a flood in advance, and they don't need all this technology to do that.
Yeah, I mean, Polynesians are a great example of it. We have beautiful storehouses of knowledge, which are also very, very practical. We have things like lunar calendrical systems, maramataka. Those systems can tell you across different months of the year what are the species that you should be looking out for? How are those species positioned related to, how do they relate to different astronomical and weather events, climatic patterns? There's so much information that those systems can help when it comes to observing nature. We also have our kapehu whetū. Because we come from traditional voyaging societies, we relied on the movement of our celestial relations, because they are also our ancestors. We can read their language, meaning the appearance of certain stars and the brightness of those stars at different times of the year actually give us cues and clues as to what's going to happen within weather patterns. There's many other examples of the kinds of knowledge that are super helpful when combined with Western science. You're going to have a much more holistic nature-based approach that can give you a long-term view of that ecosystem. That's what's missing. A lot of scientists of today can only tell you, there's restrictions as to what they can tell you. We have longitudinal information and we have knowledge systems that can help continue that vision of hundreds and hundreds of years of occupying and living, thriving on this planet.
That's so true. This has been a really amazing conversation, and I've learned many things with you, and I'm really inspired by your I don't like the word mission, but your
It's absolutely a
purpose of
mission.
life. Yeah, well, it's true. Yeah, because mission is too military.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean,
No, like
while I
purpose.
have my critiques of Western conservation, I'm working with a lot of Western conservation groups. It's a process, but it does start with basic respect and acknowledgement of the vital leadership role that Indigenous communities must play to be able to solve the climate crisis that we're presently in. We can't solve the climate crisis with the same economic system that got us there. So, I guess my call to action for your listeners is really to rethink about how we as societies value nature. And that value shouldn't be derived solely as thinking of nature as a resource to be offset or a ledger to be balanced, but as a living system of kinship. So this movement, this mission that you spoke of, it's really about relational repair. And I want to invite everyone to follow and champion our Āvei Moana expedition across the Pacific and to support Indigenous-led conservation, Indigenous-led nature markets that are moving beyond carbon and biodiversity offsets to something more aligned, I guess, with the concept of blue natural capital, which is about seeing the ecosystem as a total whole, much more aligned to Indigenous values, and to stand with us, stand with us as we fight to restore the life force of our blue planet so both people and the tōhora can flourish once more.
Thank you so much. It was really a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Kia ora. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.